this event. It's great to see so many people here and to see so much interest. I teach English at Maynooth University. Maynooth University is just west of Dublin, for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of Ireland. I am lucky enough to be the co-editor with my redoubtable colleagues, Ronit Lenton and David Landy, who are both here, of the book that we're celebrating this evening, Enforcing Silence, Academic Freedom, Palestine, and the Criticism of Israel. This book was published in May of last year, and of course we had hoped originally to have a live, face-to-face, person-to-person, cheap wine glass to cheap wine glass launch for the book. And we actually thought that, of course, you know, in the autumn that this might be possible, but none of us had any idea as to what the trajectory of the virus crisis would be. But it's great to see so much interest and to see so many people all at once online. I haven't actually met so many people online in one go so far, so this is very exciting. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge support of our publishers at Zed Books and Bloomsbury Publishing, and also the support of the MPhil in Race, Ethnicity and Conflict Studies at the Department of Sociology in Trinity College in Dublin. And I also want to acknowledge the support of Academics for Palestine. This book, as some of you will know, arose out of a conference that David and Ronit and myself held at Trinity College in Dublin in September 2017. And the purpose of the conference and of the book that has emerged from it was really to try to discuss a particular nexus of problems concerning academic freedom, the increasingly managerial, neoliberalized universities that some of us have the mixed fortunes to work in. We're lucky if we have tenure and we work in them. And if you like, our test case, the limit example, if you want, for the possibility of dissent or critical debate in that kind of university institution of the Israel-Palestine question. So today, to launch the book, we have three of our contributors who very generously offered their time and shown their willingness to speak for us. Yara Hawari, Ariane Shavizi, and John Reynolds. Each speaker will speak for not much more than, say, 14 or 15 minutes. I'll be timing them, and some of our other contributors are present, and they might like to say a word or two after the three main speakers. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. It'd be great if you could write your questions into the chat sidebar for the on your Zoom screen, and that'd be great. And everybody is being very impressive regarding muting their mics, including obviously myself earlier. Your chairperson managed to mute himself. Such was my brilliance. So I'd like to turn to our first speaker, who is Dr. Yara Hawari. If that's okay with Yara. Yara is the senior analyst at Al-Shabaka, which is the Palestinian Policy Network. And she is also a senior research fellow at the University of Exeter. Yara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Conor, for that introduction. And thank you so much to all of you for joining this evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you may be. And a big thank you for the organizers of this event and for putting the book together in the first place. My chapter in the book is entitled The Academic Boycott and Beyond, Towards an Epistemological Strategy of Liberation and Decolonization. And it is a mouthful, but I hope it's more than just a mouthful. It focuses on the academic boycott, and it particularly looks at how it emerged as a grassroots movement from Palestine and Palestinian civil society. But it also importantly argues that the boycott of the Israeli Academy is not enough in the struggle for liberation and decolonization. I argue that it must go hand in hand with the recentering of Indigenous Palestinian voices and forms of knowledge as a way to counter both epistemic and material erasure. Now, my chapter hoped to present a more radical scholarly practice that is committed to liberation and decolonization, but of course, within the understanding that academia and academic institutions in the West, unfortunately, continue to be complicit in past and ongoing colonization. So perhaps I'll begin with just talking a little bit about what the academic boycott actually is. So the academic boycott, the Palestinian academic boycott preceded the 2005 civil society boycott statement. But actually, it followed on from earlier calls to boycott Israel in a variety of spheres. And it was established in 2004 by a group of academics based in Ramallah. And it was officially called the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic Boycott of Israel, or PACB for short. What they did was that they called upon international colleagues to comprehensively boycott Israeli academic institutions until Israel withdraws from the lands occupied in 1967, agrees to the right of return for refugees, and ends a system of apartheid across historic Palestine. Now, later, PACB would come under the umbrella of the BDS National Committee, the BNC. The essence of this boycott is the recognition that Israeli universities are major, willing, and persistent accomplices in Israel's regime of occupation, of settler colonialism, and apartheid. And just to give you an idea of this complicity, these institutions are involved in developing weapon systems and military doctrines that are deployed in Israel's, have been deployed in Israel's war crimes in Lebanon and Gaza. The complicity includes the justification of the ongoing colonization of Palestinian land, the rationalizing of gradual ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, providing moral justification for extrajudicial killings, and systematically discriminating against non-Jewish students, and many other implicit and explicit violations of human rights and international law. Now, the academic boycott has faced a lot of criticisms from adversaries who support Israel and who minimize the violations against the Palestinian people. Many of us know who they are, so no need to name them here or give them airtime. But it's also faced controversy and accusations from more liberal academics who argue that it is a barrier in the way of free speech, or that it forecloses listening to others, or that it forecloses hearing other viewpoints, and fundamentally undermines academic freedom. And I think this concept of academic freedom is worth unpacking. In essence, what do we mean when we say academic freedom? It's the protection of knowledge producers, of knowledge production itself, the right to research, publish, and teach without hindrance, etc., which all sounds incredibly rational and fair. But it doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. Indeed, there are ethic guidelines in place at most institutions with regards to fieldwork, research subjects, data protection, etc. And I think one of the crucial points that many miss in this discussion is that academic freedom cannot come at any cost. Indeed, it has to come with obligations to uphold the liberty of others through the recognition of violations against such freedoms and through the avoidance of complicity with those violations. Judith Butler once explained that the privileging of academic freedom as a value above all other freedoms is actually antithetical to the very foundation of human rights. It's also important to note that it's been asserted many times that boycott is a legal form of political expression that doesn't constitute a hindrance to free speech. And of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there have been many victories within the academic boycott campaign. For example, in 2013, the American Studies Association voted unanimously to endorse the academic boycott of Israel. Others include the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the African Literature Association, and the Critical Ethnic Studies Association. Furthermore, in 2015, a group of over 300 British academics from dozens of British universities signed a declaration to boycott Israeli academic institutions as well as academic events funded by them. And additionally, support has come from students themselves, and dozens of student unions around the world have pushed motions to endorse BDS on their campuses. And I'm sure there are many other victories, far too many to mention now. Now, as I mentioned, this chapter isn't only about the academic boycott. I also wanted to talk about better political and ethical practices beyond the boycott. And the reason I wanted to write about this was from a place of frustration from my experiences, mostly in the British Academy, where declared allies of Palestinian rights or supporters of BDS were still engaging in problematic practices that resulted in the marginalization and even erasure of Palestinian voices. So I'm going to share a couple of anecdotes throughout this presentation, but one in particular springs to mind, and this was several years back at the University of Sussex, held a conference to reflect on 50 years of the Israeli occupation and its implications for both Palestinians and Israelis. And the conference had promised to host both academic and non-academic speakers, including activists. Now, the conference itself had incredibly problematic presentations, which included racist and negating language. Furthermore, it hosted twice as many Israeli presenters than Palestinian presenters. There was also an incident when me and a colleague, another Palestinian woman, called out these issues, these fundamental and inherent issues, in a session at the end of the conference in which we were asked to give feedback. And we were verbally attacked by one of the conference organizers and also physically intimidated. But what was worse than this attack was that it was done in full sight of supposed comrades and allies, and hardly anyone stood up to our defense. Now, in addition to being let down by allies in academic spaces, I, as many others, also feel a frustration at the ongoing epistemic violence that is totally normalized in the mainstream academy. And here I'll share another anecdote where this was aptly demonstrated to me, and this time it's across the pond. I think it was in 2017 at the International Studies Association conference in San Francisco. And there was a panel I think a presentation titled The Arab-Israeli Conflict, Israel's Approach. And basically this presentation was discussing whether it was more strategic for Israel to, and I quote, mow the lawn or, quote, destroy the garden in Gaza. Now, mowing the lawn in Israeli military rhetoric refers to the routine but endless military operational practice of bombarding its enemies in order to debilitate them. And in Gaza, this is, as we all know, manifested through countless bombardments and assaults nearly every few years. Now, destroying the garden in this same rhetoric refers to a much more violent strategy of neutralizing the enemy entirely, which in other words would result in an even deadlier outcome for Gaza. So here we had a panel of people genuinely academically debating which was a more effective military tactic. And this was a space considered to be progressive and liberal. And here it was reproducing dangerous structures of power in which dehumanizing rhetoric justifies mass violence. Now, of course, there are perhaps more there are obvious examples, these are obvious examples, but epistemic violence can also be more insidious and replicated through the silencing or marginalizing of certain voices. And I want to read here just an excerpt from a lecture performance entitled Decolonizing Knowledge by the Portuguese artist and writer Grada Colomba, who delivered these really powerful words. They place the discourses of Black, people of color scholars back at the margins as deviating knowledge, while white discourses remain at the center as the norm. When they speak, it is scientific. When we speak, it is unscientific. And when they speak, it is universal. When we speak, it is specific. When they speak, it is objective, and when we speak, it is subjective. When they speak, it is neutral, and when we speak, it is personal. When they speak, it is rational, and when we speak, it is emotional. When they speak, it is impartial. When we speak, it is partial. When they speak, it is that they have facts. And when we speak, it's that we have opinions. When they speak, it's that they have knowledge. And when we speak, it is that we have experiences. These are not simple semantic categorizations. They possess a dimension of power that maintains hierarchical positions. We are not dealing here with a simple semantic, but rather with a violent hierarchy which defines who can speak. I think these words so clearly speak to many of us who have been marginalized in the academy. Now, whilst the political agenda in the Western Academy may seem antithetical to a more liberatory scholarship, particularly as it continues along this neoliberal trajectory, I do still think that there are opportunities for scholars and allies to create spaces that are geared to a more liberatory and decolonial approach. But I think this necessitates us moving towards a more politically engaged scholarship, which really considers in depth the lived realities of communities which are studied. But it also means making sure that scholarly work has a positive and a potentially transformative impact. Indeed, Frantz Fanon argued that it is no longer a question of knowing the world, but of transforming it. In these same spaces, epistemic violence and its very real consequences have to be fought against, as do epistemic norms that contribute to the erasure of indigenous and native voices. You know, being a politically engaged scholar was and continues not to be a choice for many marginalized and oppressed people. It's actually born out of this existential necessity to challenge hegemonic discourse that seeks to erase and marginalizes experiences of the oppressed. So, and by way of conclusion, this chapter has argued that those committed to the academic boycott of Israel's settler colonial regime must also be committed to a wider practice of decolonization and repoliticization of the academy. The practice of boycotting Israeli academic institutions, projects, events, as well as individuals who are directly complicit in Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people is important, but it's not enough. The structural hierarchies within the academy and the material consequences these have for Palestinians and Palestine necessitates so much more. Thank you.
It's fantastic, Yara. Thank you very much. I was struck listening to your quotation from the Portuguese writer whose name I didn't quite catch, and it reminded me of this marvelous line, which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, from Fanon, from The Wretched of the Earth, where at some point he says that for the native, objectivity is always against him. And it's just, it's a very telling and pithy formulation. That's great. Our second speaker is Dr. Ariane Shavizi. So I'd like to introduce Ariane now. And before actually I go on to introduce Ariane, just for a second, I just want everyone to know that the proceedings are being recorded. And I hope that that is okay with everyone. This was discussed as we opened. Okay. So Dr. Ariane Shavizi is Senior Lecturer in Ethics at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, which is part of the University of Sussex, which is a part of the world that I feel very warmly towards since I took my own DPhil at Sussex a very long time ago. So Ariane, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Connor. And thank you so much for asking me to speak at this event, at the launch of this important book. And thanks so much to Ronit, Connor and David for all their work in putting together the volume, but also in organising today's event. Thank you, Yara, for starting us off with such a kind of powerful talk. Rather than talk about my chapter within the book, in my contribution today, I want to discuss some more recent developments in relation to academic freedom more broadly, and also to talk about how these changes affect the discursive space for the criticism of Israel. So the ideas I'll be talking about will link to the arguments that I made in the book, but I'll be talking a little bit differently about some more recent stuff. And I apologise for almost exclusively talking about the UK context, by the way. It's the only one I know well enough to discuss. And so I kind of want to talk about two claims. The first claim and this is a more general claim than us talking specifically about Palestine and Israel, is that academic freedom is under threat in universities in such a way as to require government intervention. And so I'm going to call this claim into question. And the second claim I want us to talk about is this claim that the most worrying challenges to academic freedom come from the left, from students demanding political correctness or something to that effect. So I'll talk about these, and I'll kind of weave my way towards talking about Palestine and Israel as I go on. So first, just to give a little bit of background, in October last year, Education Secretary Gavin Williamson threatened to cut the funding of universities who failed to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And in February of this year, he announced the introduction of a free speech and academic freedom champion, so-called, for universities, tasked with investigating breaches of academic freedom and issuing fines. And so what follows are some remarks that relate to that particular context. That first claim, this claim that academic freedom is gravely under threat and the government must intervene. So the first thing to note here is that there's data on this, and the authors of a 2018 parliamentary committee report concluded that, and I quote, "We did not find the wholesale censorship of debate in universities which media coverage has suggested," and that they reviewed 10,000 student union events and found that only 6 of them had in fact been cancelled, and 4 of them had missed their deadlines for paperwork. One of them was just a scam, and the other one was a Jeremy Corbyn rally, which was arranged without enough notice. And so at least some of this kind of moral panic can be traced to the fact that the libertarian website Spiked, which some of you will have heard of, it's a kind of a slightly awful place, published free speech university rankings in 2015 and gave red rankings to universities that were deemed to be limiting free speech. But if you dig into that data, and people have, 90% of those incidents are just the application of standard university procedures. And one university, for example, was given like a red score for preventing payday loans companies from coming onto campus. And so, you know, I'm saying all of this just to kind of, you know, dispel this claim. And in the report that Gavin Williamson wrote, he mentions 3 sort of cautionary tales. Won't surprise you that none of these cautionary tales relate to scholars who are attempting to show solidarity with Palestinians, but rather relate to other sorts of cases. So one of those cases was a historian called Cillian Todd, whose invitation to speak at a festival was withdrawn, and this was because other speakers refused to share a platform with her because she has links to an organization that is transphobic. The second case, and the important thing to note there is that the event in question was not a university event, okay? And so this isn't a question of academic freedom per se. Williamson also mentions a student who lost his place on a social work course after expressing homophobic views. The university removed his place on the grounds of fitness to practice, not a question of free speech. Again, that relates instead to standards of care within a particular profession. And then Williamson's final example is the case of sociologist Noah Carl, whose work on eugenics and links to far-right groups led to his dismissal from a college of the University of Cambridge. And the college basically concluded that his scholarship was very poor and therefore fell outside any kind of protection that it might otherwise have. So, and I think this last point's very important because excluding particular people from the spaces that we have within universities is entirely within the remit of universities. Upholding standards within universities is very much a part of what we do. It's what we do through admissions criteria, grading, peer review. It's part of what it means to be an academic community to uphold particular standards. And while there are sometimes moral and pedagogical reasons for keeping certain people off campus, because of course no student can learn in a room in which their dignity is in question, in reality, we rarely call upon these reasons. The reasons why people are excluded from campuses are usually because they're peddling marginalizing ideas and marginalizing ideas don't tend to be very academically interesting. And so the sorts of people who have kind of fanatical levels of personal prejudice can be kind of excluded on the grounds that they're often not very interesting thinkers. And so, you know, all of that just to say that I think that the way in which we think about academic freedom in the UK at the moment, and the particular kind of threat that it's under, is being mischaracterized by the government at the moment. Lots of the stuff they're talking about is not really a problem, and then there is stuff that is a problem that they're not talking about. And so I kind of want to move on to this second claim and talk about this kind of myth that the most worrying challenges to academic freedom are coming from the left. Okay. And I think there's a few things that it's interesting to note here. And the first thing to note is that in the last year, there have been various different incursions on freedom of expression more generally. Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden wrote to lots of heritage bodies last year, insisting that they steer clear of activism or politics, asking them to act impartially, telling them that, you know, the government doesn't support the toppling of statues, and, you know, referring to public funding in a way that made it very clear what the stakes were there. Last June, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, Kemi Badenoch, announced that teachers who were teaching white peoples about white privilege and what she called inherited racial guilt, you know, would be doing something that was illegal. And in September, the Department of Education released guidance on the national curriculum, which made it unlawful to use teaching materials produced by organizations that have, and I quote, a publicly stated desire to abolish capitalism, right? So the government clearly has this kind of its own incursions upon academic freedom at the same time that it's claiming that others are in fact a threat. And none of this, of course, is to claim that silencing is not a problem. And I will get to talking about Israel in just a moment, but it's worth noting that academics working on any issue relating to race and gender more generally, particularly women of color, live under the continual threat of abuse and doxing, rape and death threats. And of course, these attacks are most of the time coming from outside of the university, and they're affecting other public figures as well. But this is never acknowledged in government discussions on academic freedom. The fact that this cancelling, if we want to call it that, is heavily gendered and racialized, and the fact that the government's framing of its, you know, so-called war on woke actually exacerbates these dangers to particular people as well, to already marginalized scholars and students. And the other thing it's worth noting is that disinvitations to campus speakers are more likely to be successful when they come from objectors to the right of the speaker than when they come from objectors to the left of the speaker. Okay, so that's also worth bearing in mind. Another topic that the government tends to ignore in its concerns about academic freedom is the effect that the prevent agenda has had upon higher education. So this is a kind of counter-terrorism measure. And it requires universities to monitor external speaker invitations, including for events which take place off campus, and to report students who staff or students who arouse suspicion, and keep an eye on extremism-related research. Unsurprisingly, it ends up disproportionately targeting Muslim students as well, and staff, as well as those who support Palestine and criticize the Israeli government. And so between 2015 and 2018, over 2,000 events were referred under the prevent agenda, and 53 ended up being cancelled. So this is where the problem is, one of the places where there is a real problem to be discussed. But perhaps most importantly, and finally to bring us round to what we're here today to talk about, perhaps most importantly, in that February report, Gavin Williamson failed to mention Israel. And it's a very striking omission, given the way things feel on the ground. I was a year into my first academic job when US scholar Stephen Slater was fired from his post at the University of Illinois after criticizing the actions of the Israeli government during Operation Protective Edge, as it was called, in which over 2,000 Palestinians were killed. And Stephen Slater has since found himself unemployable, essentially, in academia, though continues to obviously write beautifully in between his shifts as a school bus driver in Washington, D.C. And I think, you know, my personal and scholarly interest in academic freedom really dates to that summer, you know, 1 year into my academic career when this happened. And of course, I was very much left with the thought, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. And it's one that I still feel there really is a lot of fear around this. And more recently, of course, we have seen the success of campaigns to present Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite and thereby destroy the political credibility of the only politician in recent years who's posed a real threat to British establishment politics. Last year, Goldie Osuria, political sociologist at the University of Warwick, was subjected to a disciplinary procedure after, you know, discussing Israel and Palestine in a teaching session. David Miller, professor of political sociology at the University of Bristol, whose research focuses on, amongst many other things, attacks on those voicing solidarity with Palestinians, is currently fighting the efforts of various different groups that are attempting to get him fired. None of these cases are ever mentioned in the government's documents about academic freedom and freedom of speech more generally. And this really is a threat to the kinds of conversations we are able to have in our jobs as academics. I have had this experience myself in that a few years ago, after a teaching observation, I was told that I should avoid, wherever possible, talking about Palestine in class. I talked about Palestine in the context talking about settler colonialism. And a senior academic recently also advised me to kind of, you know, dial down my criticism of Israel's state violence if I wanted to get on in academia. And both of these pieces of advice were coming from people who care about me and who care about my career and were attempting to be helpful, right? And so, you know, these are the things that are not being discussed when the government talks about threats to academic freedom. And so there's a glaring contradiction between Williamson's recent directives, right? So on the one hand, he's insisting on the importance of free speech. On the other hand, he's threatening to sanction universities who refuse to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism devised by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, right? So at the same, these two things are happening in parallel. And of course, it begs the question then, what would happen if somebody got fired for using the wrong definition of anti-Semitism? Where would, you know, would the university then get reported to the government? You know, it all gets very silly. And, you know, the problem with this definition, I'm not going to get into the details of the problem with the definition, but it's imprecise. It conflates anti-Semitism with the criticism of Israel, and it fails to connect anti-Semitism with other forms of racism, which is a disservice to everyone affected by racism. And one of its authors, Kenneth Stern, has criticised its weaponization by right-wing groups, claiming that the definition was originally intended to help with data collection of incidents, not to constrain academic freedom. And so, you know, it threatens to sort of shrink the discursive space to advocate for the rights of Palestinians, but also, and this is perhaps my major worry in relation to that definition, you know, forcing definitions of terms on people whose job it is to question the received meanings of terms, like myself as a philosopher, is an absurd and an absolutely terrifying precedent. And so I just want to, you know, sort of just a few thoughts on the current context in the UK. And I'll finish by simply admitting that, you know, my own anxieties and increasing timidity about how to publicly criticize Israel's brutal regime and express solidarity with Palestinians shames me and also frightens me. And I hope that the book that we are here to talk about and launch will provide comfort and also courage to those in a similar position and help us with finding a way forward. Thank you.
Ariane, that was great. Thank you very much. Just before we go on to our third scheduled speaker, I'd like to say how great it is to see Jeff Handmaker and Jamil Kader and Heike Schotten and I think Hilary Aked here as well. That's 4 more of our contributors. So we have a very full roster. It's great. Thank you very much. So our third speaker is my own Maynooth colleague, Dr. John Reynolds. John is Associate Professor in the Department of Law in Maynooth University, where he teaches international law, particularly in its relationship to colonial or late colonial situations. So John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Conor. And just for starters, I suppose just want to echo the congratulations to yourself and to David and Ronit, and to say thank you really just for putting together what I think really is a crucial and timely and also just very thoughtfully curated collection together. I was very happy to be part of it. I'd encourage everyone to try and get their hands on it, and also delighted to be part of this launch with Yara and Ariane, who are both doing such important work on these questions and beyond. And I think just when Yara was talking about the need to go beyond the boycott and address some of these issues about epistemic erasures and imbalances in the voices that we hear, I was thinking of her own work and her own podcast, particularly on Al Shabaka, which I'd encourage everyone to listen to, which is a really refreshing project and a really good space for hearing just the impressive range of Palestinian critical thinking that's going on so many fundamental issues at the moment. And so I just wanted to say that while it occurred to me, it's great to see some of the other authors on the call as well, and hopefully we will hear from some of them as well, because I think it's a really rich range of chapters in the book. Obviously, it's a pity that that we couldn't get all to get together in person to do this launch last year, but I also think so much of what's happened over the past year has made it even more important now to be launching it and discussing it. And so my own chapter was focused more broadly than just Palestine. I was looking at academic discourse and debates on colonialism generally, and even just thinking about my own chapter, and if we think about some of the things that have happened across Europe and North America just in the last year in relation to speaking and teaching and writing about colonialism and race and racism, including in Palestine, and a lot of the things that have happened have been due to the reactionary kind of backlash against the issues that have been brought to the fore over recent times by Black Lives Matter and other racial justice movements. But just the sudden discovery by the US presidential administration or the British government of things like critical race theory and the idea that a form of scholarly theory all of a sudden is being named and targeted in executive orders or in British government statements in the House of Commons and so on. It's kind of incredible to see, but what we've seen, I suppose, in the US and Britain and elsewhere is this this clampdown on or attempts to clamp down at least on education around race and structural racism and related issues, obviously to do with colonial legacies and so on. And so we saw that with some of the memos and the executive orders that came from the Trump administration last year. We've also seen more recently the Biden administration committing to continuing Trump's policies on the use of the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism and its requirement in certain federal agencies and universities that receive federal funding. Adrian's talked about it. We know the problems with it. We've seen the way it's been mobilized to equate critique of Israel with anti-Semitism, and it's clearly a problem, but it's one that's also clearly one that liberals as well as conservatives don't have any issue with. And we've seen that in the US. In Germany, we have this issue coming from this non-binding motion that the Bundestag passed a couple of years ago that prohibits BDS as inherently anti-Semitic, and we see that last year producing this kind of ridiculous situation where Achille Mbembe, who's, you know, many people know, one of Africa's leading intellectuals, one of the world's leading theorists of post-colonialism and anti-racism, and he gets accused by, you know, German federal government commissioner of being racist and anti-Semitic because of his academic writings on Israel Palestine and because of his support for BDS. So that's happening in Germany. In France, obviously, we've seen this kind of outright McCarthyist assault from the education ministry there against decolonial scholars who've been targeted in quite openly Islamophobic terms, essentially. And then, you know, in Britain, Ariane's talked about it a lot already, so I won't go over it. But, you know, the similar kind of trajectory in terms of the targeting of teaching and research around race and colonial legacies. You know, this idea that, you know, various kind of bizarre claims that we saw from different ministers, that this idea that teaching colonial history and quote unquote decolonizing the curriculum in whatever form that's being proposed, that somehow is amounting to censorship of history. And you know, all of this, I think, these narratives and this trajectory around race and colonialism is, you know, we can't view that in isolation from the parallel proposals and the parallel initiatives that are going on around restricting speech on Palestine and around using the IHRA definition in quite repressive ways. Right, so we could go on about that. I do just want to also mention one I suppose positive development in the last year, which was the European Court of Human Rights judgment on BDS, which said quite emphatically that boycott is a valid exercise of freedom of expression, and that criminalization of it, as had been the case that was being challenged in France, was invalid, right? So that's an important vindication, obviously, but at the same time, I don't think it fully solves the issue that we have with these kind of soft law adoptions of the IHRA definition or motions against BDS, where it's not formal legislation, so it's more difficult to be challenged legally on principle, and the real value that this mode of doing it has for its proponents is in the chilling effect that they have, and as the title of the book really alludes to, the various ways that silence is enforced through the creation of fear or uncertainty, and increasingly, you know, in the context of neoliberalism, through the vulnerability of precarious academics particularly. And I think the chapter in the book by Sinead Pembroke on precarity is really important in that context. And, you know, I was struck by what Ariane was saying there about her, you know, her own fears and uncertainties, and the way, you know, we all, and particularly Palestinians, feel constrained, you know, by the atmosphere that this is coming in. And Nick Reimer, who had a chapter in the book as well, had a really good piece recently on this, around the different kinds of silences on Palestine that academia produces. So my chapter was looking at, you know, at how academic freedom plays out primarily in the West when it comes to questions of race and colonialism. The point of departure was some of the recent scholarship that I categorized in the chapter as colonial apologism or apology for colonialism in the historical sense, was very much bound up in, you know, some of these current debates over how we reckon today with the legacies and inheritances of empire, slavery, white supremacy, historical memory and heritage, and so on. And so as well as the very real and material issues of ongoing settler colonialism and the continued oppression of Palestinians and other colonized peoples, and all of the related questions that go with that around forms of solidarity and boycott, permission to speak on Palestine, and so on. And so Bruce Gilley's article arguing the case for colonialism, Nigel Bigger's Ethics of Empire project, another incredible article by an alt-right lawyer that was published in the Journal of the History of International Law, arguing that Native Americans actually committed genocide against white settlers in the 17th century. These are some of the examples that I draw on in the chapter, and they're essentially kind of academic avatars of this right-wing culture war milieu that are very much driving the agenda of the government initiatives today that I talked about before. And so with these were cases of academic work that of course created controversy and criticism at the time, and were exposed for their factual inaccuracies, as well as just their basic kind of moral and human malice in what they were advocating. But despite the kind of self-victimization claims and the claims by those involved to have been silenced and to be stripped of their academic freedom, the reality in the cases and the way they played out was that their academic freedom, in terms of freedom to conduct research and teaching without institutional sanction or censorship, that really wasn't interfered with in any way. Their institutions deferred to their academic freedom. In some cases said, we don't agree necessarily with what they're saying, but we absolutely defer to their academic freedom. And there was no question of any of them being sanctioned or at risk of losing their positions. And so my point in the chapter wasn't to argue the merits of this either way, but really just to emphasize that Western university defenses of academic freedom have been fairly unflinching in cases of this type of pro-colonial scholarship, whereas on the other hand, stories of racialized scholars like Stephen Saleta on Palestine that Ariane mentioned, like Johnny Williams and Tommy Curry and so many others on questions around race and racism in the US, their stories show us that when it comes to the expression of anti-colonial and anti-racist positions, that academic freedom really remains vulnerable and conditional. And in those cases, those scholars were suspended or sanctioned or lost their jobs. And we saw in the discourse and the debates around them a lot of the tropes that Yara read in that excerpt that she was reading, a lot of those tropes really being reproduced in terms of how the scholars as anti-colonial scholars or as colonized voices were kind of cast as emotional and angry and so on, and all of the stereotypes that we're familiar with. And so their academic freedom is weighed differently. And so the upshot really is that, obviously while academic freedom is an important principle, in principle, its utility is very much contingent on the institutional power dynamics in which it's operating. So we have to also be thinking strategically about that, and not just the narrower sense of academic freedom as a shield to defend our position when it comes under attack. So I don't know how much, I haven't been keeping track. I don't know how much time I have left, Connor, or if I have any time left.
You're doing fine, John. Just round out your talk.
I was just going to read just a passage from the chapter just for my last couple of minutes, if it's okay, just to try and give a bit of a sense of the argument I'm making, just to avoid going off on more tangents and over time. And so basically following on from what I was just saying there about the contingency of academic freedom. So we see that there are particular challenges for academics who critique racism and colonialism as part of their work, or who partake in anti-colonial boycotts. The application of academic freedom principles in these contexts has been mixed at best. When we contrast the measures taken against these scholars on the one hand with the protections to pro-colonial academics and positions on the other, we see the ways in which the indeterminacy of academic freedom often still results in practice in its alignment with establishment conservatism. Academic freedom has been strongly defended in cases of academics who publish pro-colonial work or who host academic events in Israeli universities involved in the colonization of Palestinian territory. academic freedom has not cut so clearly the other way to protect anti-colonial speech, scholarship and association. This illustrates how the politics of academic freedom in the West are to a large extent ensnared by the tentacles of managerialism and the professional orthodoxies which underpin power dynamics in the modern university. The critical point then is that when we talk about academic freedom, we have to be cognizant that critical or dissenting speech is subject to background limitations that precede the explicit limitations on speech defined by courts and institutions. Like freedom of expression more broadly, academic freedom is a form of non-partisan tolerance insofar as it's formally granted in equal measures to all protagonists, but in doing so, it practically functions to lock in any already established disparities, so that the premise of a level playing field is often illusory. Writing after the experience of his own academic freedom being curtailed by disciplinary measures, Johnny Williams found that the academic freedom to speak out and pursue political or provocative research is most often not afforded faculty who are of the wrong political persuasion, race, or religion. Suppression of academic freedom is especially pronounced for socially defined Black faculty who critically examine white supremacy. The ways in which academic freedoms are contingent and loaded in this sense have a depoliticizing effect which serves to ensure that most faculty will not use their teaching and scholarship to foment the social seeds necessary to mobilize revolt against systemic oppressions. And so that's going back to the point again about silence being enforced and imposed. And then just the last paragraph, for academic freedom to be meaningful, it has to be rooted to an emancipatory ethic and an underlying claim to justice. The academic freedoms afforded to pro-colonial scholarship or to association with a colonizing university remind us that academic freedom in itself is not an inherently progressive force. Progressive scholars should invoke and accentuate it where it makes tactical sense to do so, while understanding that there may be limits to how far it can take you and remaining conscious of its pitfalls. Sophie Smith puts it like this: academic freedom is a principle worth defending, but it is foolish to ignore its costs and who disproportionately quietly bears them. In the academic discourses on race and colonialism, those who remain most at risk of bearing those costs are typically radical and racialized and precarious scholars. In the ongoing struggles over legitimacy in institutional spaces and the emancipation of knowledge production, their voices should be amplified so that the case for colonialism can no longer be heard. Thanks.
Thank you, John. That's great. We now have time for questions and discussion. I'd suggest that people put their questions in the chat function. Before we move on to questions, I just want to draw your attention to what Ronit has just written in the chat sidebar, which is about the availability of the book, because ideally we'd like to shift copies, of course. So Ronit has pointed out that the publishers have promised us a discount of 33%, which is a nice hefty discount on purchasing the book, but there are problems with the discount code that they have supplied us. So if anybody who is interested in buying the book, not writing the book, thank you very much, we've done that, please contact Ronit or David or myself, and we will try to send you the code or otherwise fix the situation for you. So hopefully you can access the book in that way. The first question in the sidebar, I wonder, David, if you can help me with this. It pertains to the access to the recording in the future.
Yeah, we hope to make this available on the Academics for Palestine site and perhaps also on the Trinity website. We'll put information on the Facebook event page about where it will be available.
That's great, David. There's a substantial question paragraph here from Jenny. Shall I read the question out, or would the speakers like to look at what Jenny has written herself? Jenny is wondering about the case of educational institutions and organizations within and outside academia. How can Palestinian institutions, in particular educational and cultural institutions within and outside universities, such as museums, be more visible, decolonize, and contribute to international and specifically EU institutions? It's the example of the European School Net, which is funded by the European Commission, but doesn't have any contributing institutions from Palestine, although they host Palestinian material appropriated and contributed by Israeli institutions. Jenny also asks, what forms could the boycott take in a case like this? I wonder if any of our speakers or indeed any of our additional contributors who are present have any views on a question of that kind.
I mean, I could start.
Thanks, Yara.
Palestinian academic and cultural institutions do have pretty good partnerships around the world, in particular in Europe. But always, of course, I think there could be more, and for anyone interested, they should reach out directly to those institutions. But I think it's worth noting that Palestinian academic institutions and cultural institutions, for that matter, don't exist in isolation. They too are undergoing or have undergone a sort of neoliberal transformation where education has very much become a commodity. And so, this unfortunately is also increasingly the case in Palestine. So, like I mentioned, I don't think necessarily we're going to decolonize from within these spaces, whether they're in these Palestinian institutions or outside. But I do think certainly these spaces can foster safe spaces in which discussions can be had, in which sort of like-minded people can think together. I didn't understand the question about the boycott specifically, and what forms could the boycott take in this case. Perhaps if we could have clarification on that, and then maybe I could think of a way to answer it.
Does anyone else want to chip in there alongside Yara?
Well, I mean, I can maybe just jump in here. I mean, the No Aerial Ties campaign, which has been initiated by PACB together with the BNC, has been quite successful. Amongst many of the latest successes has been a decision to remove aerials from a list in Finland, so they don't gain access to funds for the European Union Horizon 2020 project. I mean, it's important symbolic value, but also has had structural impact as well. So that's something to celebrate, I would say.
Jeff. Okay, there was a question which is now gone up in the chat, and I can't see it anymore, about whether any Irish universities have come under pressure or pressure to adopt the IHRA definition. I wonder if anyone here present can answer that. Thanks, John.
Yeah, so there may be others who might know more than me, but not as far as I'm aware of. I mean, the debate and the discussion around the IHRA definition in the Irish context hasn't been as advanced as it has elsewhere, and it's come up. There was Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, made some comments earlier this year around a kind of a general commitment to the work of the IHRA. I can't remember exactly his wording. There was a some form of ministerial declaration that was made last year, from what I remember. But there was also this anti-racism national plan that's been initiated last year, and with the potential for a better approach to approaching anti-Semitism and the discussions around anti-Semitism and the needs address it as part of a broader discussion and focus around racism more broadly. And so, you know, I'm not aware of specific pressures or measures that have come up in the university context, but others might correct me on that. You know, I suppose just in more general terms, obviously, you know, the extent of discussion now all over the world, including among a lot of Jewish groups around the issues and the problems with the IHRA definition, and now, you know, alternative definitions being proposed, which have, you know, some of which have their own different problems and issues, but, you know, I think increasingly there is an awareness and a recognition, you know, that this isn't going to be the way to solve these the issues that need to be solved.
Thank you. I'd like to draw your attention to a question from Michael, who was asking if the turn to Zoom and other modes of online pedagogy that a lot of us have had to work with across the last year, if the use of things like Zoom rather than intimate or typically physical classroom settings has played out in terms of increased visibility, permanent online access in regard to teaching and teaching controversial material. Michael is asking if people were already cautious to speak in the physical setting, how more cautious might people become engaging in what can be a more public forum?
Yeah, I can say something about this. It's a great question, Michael. Thank you. Yeah, I spoke at an event recently about academic freedom more generally, and everyone who was present essentially agreed that this was an increased concern in the current context. And I really do feel it when I'm teaching now. Most of our teaching is now recorded, where I'm teaching anyway. I don't know what the case is for others, but of course, even if it's not being recorded, the fact that you're doing it through something like Zoom, there are ways in which people can record things without you knowing them as well, right? So we know this is being recorded at the moment, but there are other ways of recording what's going on your computer. So you're never really completely sort of free of that sort of surveillance. And it changes the way that I teach. I'm very aware that the things that I say, it's not that I'm expecting to say anything that I will regret, but of course, sometimes you phrase something in a way that is clumsy when you're kind of put on the spot, or you're asked a question, you've got to construct an answer in a kind of hurried way. And of course, it's immortalized. And so the sorts of things that we were worrying about before, certainly for me, they're much more worrying in the current environment. And I think that undoubtedly it has made my teaching less interesting because I am self-censoring in terms of the sorts of examples that I will use, the directions that I will lead the discussion in. And I think that's, it's sad, but it kind of reflects some of the anxieties that I was talking about. And if that's the direction of travel in the future, as it looks like it might be, then we have much more reason for concern than we have had before.
I'd like to add to what Ariana has just been saying.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have the same sense of it, although I've been on sabbatical, so I haven't been teaching as much through the Zoom era, but you know, I imagine that is and will be a big factor. I mean, I think like with a lot of these issues around technological advances, you know, I think it's a really important question, Michael, but I think it's also, you know, like with a lot of these things, this is the next elevation or escalation of an issue that, you know, has been there already in different forms, and going back, you know, with let's say the previous kind of 10 to 15 years of the smartphone camera, you know, context of people, you know, and whether it's in classes or in conference contexts, people who have an agenda, who want to record you, you know, have been doing that for for some time already. Obviously, it makes it much easier now with the, you know, with the online webinar or online teaching format to do so. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Ariane's point about self-censorship is important, but I think also, you know, in a classroom and teaching context, the issue around, you know, how students feel and how comfortable they are speaking about their perspectives or experiences, not knowing, you know, who else in the class might have different agendas and so on. I think there are, you know, there are concerns there from that side as well. And, you know, I don't know that in the rush to adapt and react and mitigate the circumstances over the last year, I don't know that there's been anywhere near enough kind of thought or space given to thinking about how these issues are going to continue, because obviously, you know, in some shape or form, there's going to be pushes for modes of online teaching to continue, even when it doesn't even when it's not essential to do so anymore. And so, you know, I do think that is something important to be thinking about.
Great, Sean. I might move on to a question that's being posed by another of our contributors, Hilary Aked, which is a quite different kind of question. The question that Hilary has put in the chat is, how do we navigate situations when someone who's nominally an ally of the Palestinian cause says something really unhelpful? These people are often white men, for instance, Ken Livingston, Chris Williamson, which we might not want to defend, even if we don't necessarily think they should lose their positions, and so on. Do any of our speakers have an angle on that?
I can say something about this perhaps, because I was actually going to say something about this in my contribution at the beginning. I did consider it. I was thinking this morning, you know, whether this was something to mention, because I think it is very important. In the various bits of work over the years I've done in solidarity with Palestinians, in work for justice for Palestinians, I have encountered people, and, you know, as Hilary says, you know, more often than not, white men who, you know, are saying problematic things. And, you know, I suppose it's a kind of habit they have of saying problematic things about lots of different things as well. And I suppose, you know, the first thing to say is there's absolutely no place for racism within our movement, right? None whatsoever, or for sexism or for homophobia or whatever else it might be. And you know, personally, I think we have to be extraordinarily hard on this within our movements, because it weakens us, it embarrasses us, it you know, is completely contrary to our aims to have such people within our movements. Now, that's not to say, you know, because there was a part of the question which was, what should we do? Should they lose their positions, for example? And I think this comes down to a broader question about how we deal with people's mistakes, because sometimes it's a mistake and sometimes it's part of a pattern of a kind of systemic prejudice that that person holds, right? And it's this question of calling out and then sometimes calling in, as it were, right? So this idea that sometimes there's an opportunity to actually talk someone through why the thing that they have said is a problem and how they need to do better in the future. And that's part of providing kind of care within our movements as well, right? We all have learning to do. We've all said or done things 5, 10 years ago, however long ago, that we now know were not optimal in terms of the aims that we have. We're all learning all the time. And I think we have to be supportive of people's efforts to learn. But of course, you know, there comes a point when somebody is clearly holds views that are entirely counter to the broader struggle that you have. And as far as I'm concerned, I think within an anti-racist movement, there is no space for racism of any kind, right? And I think that if we permit such instances, then, you know, what are we even doing? What is our movement for? And we lay ourselves wide open to the sorts of things that I have been kind of warning against today. So I think we've got to take these things very, very seriously. But I think we also have to have mechanisms where we think the person can learn to actually make sure we help people with their learning, because that's another function of our movement as well.
Very good point,
Yeah.
Ariane. Thank you. Yara, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this. I mean, I would agree with what has been said so far, and I think there's a lot of work to be done still within our movement. I think, unfortunately, there is still a deeply colonial mentality when people think they know better than Palestinians, and whether that's conscious or not. Sometimes it's not at all conscious. And unfortunately, it's as a result of decades of social conditioning. For example, crossing the boycott picket line because they think, these usually white men think that they can convince that Israeli institution the error of their ways, and ignoring the fact that Palestinian civil society, by consensus, this is Palestinian consensus, has asked of our allies not to cross that picket line. This is a political tactic. It's not a principled stance. Palestinians are not petulant children who can't speak for themselves and decide on what political tactics they should follow. And so it's incredibly frustrating. And what's more, these white men, unfortunately, are more often than not given, more platforms than Palestinians to talk about their struggle. And sometimes when they are given these platforms, they say incredibly damaging things to the movement, incredibly damaging. And the people that have to pick up the pieces and do the sort of do the work to sort of fix the damage they've done is usually Palestinians who have to rush to apologize or rush to support or bring out a statement of support or a statement saying that they're not a racist movement. So I think there is a long way to go in terms of working on ourselves as a movement, and it's a combination really of calling people out and calling people in, as was mentioned. And when we call people out, there are red lines, there are deep red lines when someone takes part in hatred or really racist rhetoric, or does something really bad. And then there is calling in when people need to learn. And we're not all perfect with all, said or done things that are problematic. I hate to think 10 years ago, all of the sort of problematic practices I was involved in, and it is a learning process. So we also have to be kind to one another, but there are red lines and there are repeat offenders that I think really, need to be challenged.
Yara, it's interesting. No, go on. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Conor.
No, Joanne. I was just going to point out to everyone present that there are contributions in the sidebar. One from our colleague Lawrence Davis, and another from Angela Flynn, who is the president of the Irish Federation of University Teachers, which is the main academic union in Ireland, touching on some of the matters concerning the current use of online technology, recording and teaching. So Don, sorry, go right ahead.
No, I was just gonna. I mean, I'd echo everything that that Yara and Ariane have said about that. I mean, I think obviously, the red lines and the calling out of any racism in our movements is essential. I think that I think it's a really important question that Hill had asked, because unfortunately it does come up too often. We have too many of these kind of cases where whether it's a kind of a Palestine solidarity ally who's indulging in some of the anti-imperialism of fools kind of stuff in other contexts, or whether it's kind of problematic or awkward or poor wording and language around Israel Palestine itself. There are too many of these cases kind of coming up, and I think in some cases, sure, the calling in mode can work, but I think part of the problem with the fact that the types of characters that have been mentioned, a lot of the time they're not in a position where they're not the kind of people that are gonna listen. And so I think also I think there is an element of in certain contexts kind of strategic silence that has to be that we might not be the ideal scenario. But if it's a case where someone's under attack and you don't want, like was put in the question, you don't want them to lose their positions necessarily, but it's not the hill that you're going to die on either. And I think it is you know, something that has to be probably dependent again on the particular context and the dynamics in which it's playing out. But I think the more important part of it for me is, how is this impacting negatively on student activism or on other less experienced people who are hearing and reproducing some of the problematic language, and how can we think better about, you know, working on that side of it, so that it doesn't keep reproducing itself in the way that it has.
I'd just like to thank my colleague Jim Roach, who has rightly corrected me and pointed out that the Teachers Union of Ireland is the only union of academics to support the academic boycott. So thank you, Jim. Fair point. Do you have any more questions?
I'm just trying to scan through the chat there. I mean, there were a couple of questions about BDS laws in the US. I don't know if if Heike or someone else is still there that might be able to.
Heike has left.
I mean, I can say a few things about BDS laws in the US. I mean,
thanks, Yara.
Yeah, so a lot of states in the US have actually adopted laws or policies that penalize businesses, organizations, and individuals that engage in or call for boycotts against Israel. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of these laws and policies in place state explicitly that, you know, or rather target not only companies that refuse to do business with Israel, but also those who refuse to do business with settlements. So the situation is quite bad. There's sort of one saving grace, I think, about sort of the US context is that how highly freedom of speech is upheld. I mean, that's for better or for worse. I mean, it's also has some really nasty consequences as well. But there is wiggle room for activists to push back legally, and an organization that is doing that work relentlessly is Palestine Legal. And I think it's a slightly different context to Europe and the UK, where that sort of freedom of speech isn't so, you know, so ingrained as it is in the sort of American psyche.
Heike had put, thank you, Yara. Heike had put in a link to Palestine Legal about anti-BDS laws in the United States in the chat, which those of you who are interested will find there. Do we have more questions? Would either of my fellow editors like to ask or to either to ask a question or to make a point?
I would just like to say,
thanks,
that we in Ireland have reasonably lucky in comparison with the US and with the UK and France and other places, in that we are not as silenced. And in fact, our conference, despite the attempt by the heads of Israeli universities to try and shut us up and by flooding us with irrelevant and bad paper proposals, and later on by going to the provost and asking him post facto to disown the conference, the university stood behind us. In fact, they even gave us a few bobbers, as far as I remember. So the point is, like the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Academics for Palestine are reasonably fortunate in being able to conduct pro-Palestine activism, including academic activism. There's been no pressure to adopt the IHRA, as far as I know, even though Ireland is being pressurized to adopt it as a country, but not at university level. And in fact, I have been able for many years to run conferences on Palestine in Trinity and to publish out of this work. So I think in a way we have a better space here to be able to conduct, I don't know if David agrees with me, if Connor agrees with me, but I feel we have a better space to be able to conduct this sort of work, and hence this book, and thank you very much to all the wonderful contributors. But I've noticed that there have been a couple of participants in the seminar from Israeli academics. Some Israeli academics have joined. And I know that part of the problem is that the suppression of academics in Israel by the Israeli government and the Israeli Ministry for Education is absolutely dire. And they spend money not only on suppressing BDS outside of Israel, but also on suppressing any form of criticism within Israel itself. Even though all academics in Israel benefit from being academics because many of them participate in training military personnel, many of them indirectly participate in producing armament and security systems, whatever. But there is a group called Academia for Equality who are trying to address these issues. So in fact, the suppression starts from not only from Palestine, but Israel itself. It suppresses its own people, suppresses the people under occupation, and suppresses people discussing Israel and Palestine throughout the world. So far, it's getting away with it. And it's up to all of us to continue its work in terms of keeping them in check. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ronit. My Maynooth colleague, Chandler Mathur, has asked if it's possible for US scholarly societies to broach the BDS question in the wake of President Trump's executive order. Does anyone have an opinion on that or information on that question?
Well, the executive order, as I remember it, was doing a few things. One of which was incorporating anti-Semitism specifically into some of the civil rights legislation, and essentially requiring federal agencies to use the IHRA definition when dealing with anti-discrimination in the context of anti-discrimination law. So that was a broader issue. And then when it came to the education component of it, it was specifically to do with funding with universities that receive funding from the federal government. So if you're a university and you want to be able to access that funding, you had to adopt and apply the IHRA definition on campus, as I understood it. So how that relates to academic societies or associations that are in a slightly separate space, I don't remember seeing anything explicit around that. And obviously they have, a certain amount of autonomy, both from universities and from I presume if they're, depending on funding structures and so on, most of them wouldn't be implicated in that. But I don't, someone else may know better than me. I don't remember any specific language around that. And obviously there are a number of associations and groups in US scholarly disciplinary contexts that have already endorsed and implemented boycott resolutions. And I haven't heard of that being forced to go backwards, but I could be corrected on that.
John. Any further questions? I feel that my host, Dr. Landy, is about to say something pregnant with importance.
Not huge amount of importance. Just one question for the contributors. I think like around 8 o'clock, I think Dara Fox asked a question saying, "Is it all too much?" Is the situation a bit like, has it gone too far? And I think, as Ronit was saying, like certainly in Ireland, the institutional landscape is probably much more hopeful than elsewhere. But also the other thing that we are trying to do with this book was not just kind of like outline misery, but also outline, steps that have been taken and can be taken successfully by academics together to talk about, you know, to combat efforts by Israel and its supporters to suppress free speech. And one of the points I kind of like to make is that it has been actually quite successful. You know, people are still talking about Palestine. They haven't, despite all the pressure being put on us, and I don't want to be too optimistic, don't worry. But despite all the pressure being put on us, there has been successes. And I wonder if the speakers would like to, because I know we're coming to an end now, but would maybe like to conclude by saying like what can be done and what is good successful action to be taking on speaking up and working for Palestine within the academic frame.
Can I jump in on there, David? Take that invitation. I mean, I do think that it is very important to acknowledge the very real threats. And, you know, in the chat, we've been talking about this toxic environment in the United States. It's toxic in Germany as well, for sure. But the Netherlands, for example, which was recently a number of leftist academics who were attacked, were defended by the most prestigious sort of academic associations in the country. So there is actually quite a lot of space regarding academic freedom, including criticisms of Israel in the Netherlands. But people do tend to feel a sense of fear and intimidation because there are very legitimate threats across the world. And getting published in an academic journal, for example, on a topic like this is extremely challenging. I know, because I'm currently, you know, facing those difficulties, as many of us are. So that is a big problem for sure. But I do think we need to recognize that there are successes and that so much of this is just smoke and mirrors. I mean, a lot of the reason why I wrote this chapter in the book was to try and demystify the shameless weaponization of the working definition, era working definition. People heard that the Dutch Labour Party accepted it, and they did, but then they rejected it. But you don't hear about the fact that there's a pushback either. And I think it's important that we do recognize there are spaces where there is quite some academic freedom, and to try and work within those spaces to amplify these issues much more frequently, much more consistently, and to reach out to colleagues at those institutions much more persistently. And yeah, it's easy to get, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's easy to get caught up in the negativity of what we're facing. And I think we also do need to find, possibilities to feel optimistic as well, because indeed it is still very much on the agenda. And I'm not negating the negativity of this either, please.
Thank you, Jeff. While there is debate in our sidebar chat as to whether or not Ireland constitutes a utopia, I would note that I was talking to students just this morning about Yevgeny Zamyatin's marvelous novel, We, which is about a dystopian utopia. I'd like to start to bring things towards a conclusion by asking if our speakers have any, if our three primary speakers have any concluding remarks that they'd like to make. And then we might bring things to a wrap. Yara, would you like to say anything more?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what people can do to, especially in the academy, to continue supporting the movement, I think supporting Palestinians and especially Palestinian academics here in Palestine is incredibly important, either through material support or through inclusion, you know, always trying to invite Palestinian academics to events, to take part in academic projects and papers and books, and not just the ones with nice British accents, but also sort of expanding beyond our sort of known group of Palestinian academics to include academics who are not necessarily at Birzeit, who might be at another Palestinian institution. And also recognizing that, you know, there are hundreds of Palestinian thinkers and scholars who are rotting in Israeli prisons. And whilst they're rotting in Israeli prisons, their minds aren't rotting. These people are incredibly active. They produce, scholarly works, they're writing all the time, and they're thinking all the time, because that's the only thing that they can do. And so I think it's incredibly important to find ways to support these, often forgotten about group of Palestinians.
That's great, Yara. Thank you very much. Ariane, would you like to chip in some concluding remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And I think that was a really important point, Yara. I was about to come out with all these negative things, because inevitably these discussions just do make you feel, make you despair slightly about the situation. But we do need to finish on a more motivational note, I guess. And I think perhaps the piece of strategic advice I can offer is maybe that what I'm seeing a lot in academia at the moment is everybody jumping on the decolonizing bandwagon, right? And almost all of the time, that's not really what they mean. And the word is being kind of used in quite unusual, imaginative, not always helpful ways. But, when we talk about Palestine, this struggle is about decolonizing. It really is about decolonizing, right? And I think it's interesting that all this talk of decolonizing, the two issues that I see being left out almost entirely of those mainstream discussions are Palestine on the one hand, and then refugees on the other, right? And I think those two issues need to be brought back into that conversation. And given that that particular word and concept is having a bit of a moment right now, I think it would be a missed opportunity if we were not to make the very best use of that and really put it to its hold it to its truest definition, and make sure that whenever we are talking about decolonizing, we are mentioning Palestine, we are teaching our students and bringing it into the sorts of talks that we give, to make sure that that link is kind of formed very firmly, and that some of the legitimacy that has recently kind of started to grow around that word will also kind of rightfully be linked with the kind of struggle for justice for Palestinians.
Great. Ariane, I think you're absolutely right. Jenny has written in the chat that we need to decolonize decolonization. Or we need to seize the discourse of decolonization and make sure it's not just the vocabulary of our managers, which is what I would fear. John.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think there's a value obviously to seizing on the moment, as Ariane had said, but I think also I think we do have to think, in broader terms about language in that context, and what, how we can challenge and expose some of the kind of misrepresentations that are going on, and where decolonization is being used as a synonym for diversity or other softer initiatives. And I think that a big part of that is obviously when if we say decolonization is not a metaphor, what does that mean then, and how does that relate to our work in relation to Palestine, in relation to Indigenous peoples elsewhere? And I think so yeah, I'd agree with that, but I think the other point I'd make, which I think is really important, just thinking about this idea of silence that you had in the title of the book. I think a big mistake that a lot of the left has made in recent years on these issues around Palestine solidarity, and how it's got all tangled up with questions around anti-Semitism, is that there's been this quite defensive position adopted a lot of the times, and there has been a kind of a retreat because people don't want to be falsely accused or misrepresented of anti-Semitism. It's that fear and that uncertainty that people do retreat, or they start moderating their critiques, or they start watering down what they're arguing. And we know that's not going to work. That's exactly playing into the hands of Israel supporters, because it's no amount of compromise is going to be enough. And so what Jeff was saying, you know, the smoke and mirrors idea, a lot of this stuff around the IHRI definition and so on, it's really trying to impose this silence through the appearance of a kind of a legal force that it doesn't actually possess, you know, and it doesn't have the power to do a lot of the stuff that it's currently doing. It's how the chilling effect kind of idea is mobilized, and it's how, you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, because too many people kind of cede ground to it. And if not enough critical scholars, for example, are talking about Palestine in the way that they should be, and then one does and is seen as kind of stepping out of line, they will seem to the university administrator or manager or whoever it is that's making a decision that they are, you know, that they are an anomaly, and that there must be something wrong there. And so it becomes this thing where managers or administrators who aren't attuned to the nuances of the issue, they have their own fears and uncertainties. Something looks out of kilter, and so they kind of start accepting the logic that, you know, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism, and then, you know, it goes from there. And so I think there's an onus on all of us, and especially on those of us that, you know, are not in the really vulnerable, precarious positions to push things further, and to try to really think about our own silences and complicities. And, you know, in that piece that I mentioned by Nick Reimer, he talks about 3 types of silences. One is the silence that's imposed through disciplinary or punitive measures, right? One is the silence that's chosen by people that choose to be supporters of Israel, or to accept the connections and so on. And then the third one is the silence conceded, which, you know, in some ways is the most insidious and most damaging, and it's, you know, it's the point around self-censorship and the point around you know, not being willing to say what we want to say because of fears of implications. And, you know, that's obviously a completely human and understandable reaction, but the more people do that, the more it hangs others who are taking the braver positions, it hangs them out to dry. And so part of this again goes back to atomization and individualization and the whole way that the neoliberal academy works now. And so I think that also kind of emphasizes the need for, you know, thinking and working through our unions and through our other kind of collective organizations, including things like the scholarly associations that was mentioned. You know, if that is a way to get around some of the IHRA definition stuff in contexts like Britain or the US, where universities themselves are being threatened with sanctions, but not, you know, that puts more of an onus then on the disciplinary associations and so on to raise their voices louder. And so, yeah, the other points then, I think what Yara was saying, you know, any of us that are editors, conference organizers, have any access to PhD or postgrad funding, you know, I think there really is an onus on us to support, mentor, invite, and work as much as possible with Palestinian scholars and students, especially who are outside at the moment outside the kind of bubbles that have access to some of the privileges that we do. And you know, I think that's a really crucial point. And I do think certainly in the last 10 years, from what I can see in the fields that I work in, you know, there are so many really important and significant kind of projects and critical thinking going on that are being driven by younger and emerging Palestinian scholars, and that are really building, you know, a quite significant canon of new Palestinian research, and are kind of claiming that space of, you know, we're not going to be just the ones providing the data for your projects. We're the ones theorizing our own experience, and we're the ones that have serious contributions to make, and we want to do that in our own terms. And that is there, and it's growing, and I think it's imperative on all of us to support that in every way we can.
I think that's a great point on which to conclude, John. So I'd like to thank our three speakers, Yara Hawari and Ariane Shavizi and John Reynolds. And I'd like to thank my co-editors and mentors, David and Ronit, and to say personally that it's been a matter of great pride for me to work on this book and to work with all of you. So that's the modern note on which I will finish. But thank you all for coming. And I hope that you'll be in touch with us in regard to potential purchasing of the book. We'll work on trying to facilitate that with you and for you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.